Hi class, today we're going to be starting our unit Analytical Geometry. Okay, so our first lesson that we're going to be looking at is 2.1, midpoint of a line segment. So just by definition, a line segment is a part or a section of a line which has a beginning and an end. Okay, so it's important to understand this. So how do we find the midpoint of a line segment? Okay. So again, what we're trying to solve for is the halfway point. So that's what we're kind of looking for. We're looking for the midpoint. We call that. So we have a formula to solve for the midpoint, and our midpoint formula is taking the coordinates x1 plus x2 divided by 2. So this would represent your new x coordinate here. And then for the y coordinate, it's y1 plus y2 divided by 2 would represent your new y coordinate as we get going. Okay. So I'm going to show you an example of how to do this, and then I'm going to have you try your own example. So what I'm going to recommend when you're doing a question is you're actually going to label the lines given to you. So for example, you're given the x coordinates here, so you could label this x1 and this x2, this y1 and y2, so you don't get confused. If you mix those up in the segment, it can change your answer, not so much in this situation, but in tomorrow's lesson. So just make sure you try to stay organized with that. So what we're trying to find is we're trying to find the midpoint of the line segment xy. So let's start with the x's first. So we start with 4, okay, plus -1, all divided by 2. That'll be our x coordinate. We put a comma in between. That's going to represent the y coordinate coming here, which is -7 plus -3 divided by 2. Again, midpoint of xy, and now we just solve for the math. So 4 plus -1 over 2 is going to leave us a value of 3 over 2. Okay. And then -7 plus -3 is going to leave us a value of -10 over 2. Now you can look at reducing the fractions that exist. So again, if they give you a nice decimal number, feel free to put them into a nice decimal number. If they do not, okay, please make sure to leave them in a fraction. So for example, 3 over 2 gives us a nice decimal number of 1.5. So that's definitely appropriate. And then -10 over 2 gives us a value of -5. So we've found that the midpoint of this line segment occurs at the coordinate point 1.5 and -5. So again, that represents your x and your y as a coordinate. So now what I would like you to do is I would like you to pause the video and try question B by yourself. Okay, so now that you've done example B, let's take this up. So we get the midpoint of KL. Okay, we start with the x coordinates, so we go -6 plus 4 divided by 2, because again, you're just trying to find the halfway point between each of them. That's why we're dividing by 2. And then -6 plus -1 divided by 2. We solve for those coordinates. We get -2 over 2, and we get -7 over 2. And again, when you're going to reduce them, just make sure that they work out nice. So, for example, -2 over 2 gives you a value of -1, okay? And then -7 over 2 gives you a value of -3.5. And that's a fine number because it works out nicely with the decimals, okay? So just make sure you're checking that. What we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next question here. Okay. Okay, guys, to find the coordinates of the point that would divide the line segment into 1/3 ratio. It's a little bit tougher of a question, but what you have to think of, if 1/3 of a ratio is 1 over 3, to complete and get a full number, it would be 2/3 would equal the other portion. So what you're going to be thinking about is splitting the lines into. So what we're going to start with is we're going to be looking at the x values. Okay. So when we're looking at the x values, what we're going to be saying is that we want to know what is 1/3 of the first value, but we also want to know what is 2/3 of the second value. So when we go about solving this, keep this in fraction work, okay? So that's all I'm doing to solve. Okay? And we would collect the like terms here, and we end up with negative 3 over 3, which gives us a value of negative 1. Okay? So we've actually found 1/3 of the way, so that's one of our points here. Okay? So negative 1. And now let's work in a different color and we'll look at the y value. So again, keeping in the same order, if we want to find that new y value, we want 1/3 of 2 added to 2/3 of our other value, which is negative 8 in this situation. So again, just because they're fractions, just please take your time when solving them. So we end up getting 1 over. Gives us a value of 2 over 3, okay, plus negative 16 over 3. So now we would add those terms together and we're left with a value of negative 4 and 2/3. Okay, so I just made it into a mixed fraction. Okay, so again, you can input this into a graph to look at to check if you want to, but we're just looking for the 1/3 of the way. Okay, so that's just a way to go about that question. Just make sure to think about what equals to the whole. So that's really the key point here of what you're working with. Okay. I'd say that question's on the harder end. So let's look at another question that I would say would be very common that could come up here.
Oh yeah? Having trouble visualizing
Change the color, things like that. There's a paid version, but of course. So with this, you take it out and there.
Okay guys, so AB is a line segment where A equals 1/3 and B is unknown. So this time we're trying to find the end point of a line segment, but what they've given us is the midpoint. Okay, so this is the midpoint. So what we can do is we can actually take the equation of the midpoint and kind of break it down in half. So we know that midpoint equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2. We know that it's y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So what we can do is we can split these into sections, so that would be one formula, and then the other formula is going to look as m is equal to y1 over y. So we're going to start by solving for the x coordinate. So we know that the midway point of this coordinate is 4. Okay, we know the beginning coordinate to be 1, but we do not know the second coordinate. But what we've done is we've actually created an equation here, okay, and we can solve for the unknown of x2. So first we would cross multiply here, so we would get 8 equals 1 plus x2. When I move the 1 to the other side, it becomes negative 1, and I find out that 7 equals the value of x2. So we've actually found the x coordinate, and now we can do the same for the y coordinate. So what I'll do is I'll give you a second to try that one out by yourself. Okay, so to solve for the y coordinate, again, you know that the midpoint is negative 2. We know what the beginning coordinate is, negative 3, but we do not know what the second y coordinate is. So plugging that in the formula, now we cross multiply. We move 3 to the negative 3 to the other side. We get a value of negative 1 equals y. So what we've done is we've solved for x and negative 1, so that equals the coordinate b. I would say that's a pretty common question that you guys will come across in the homework and say on a test. So that is all for today. So the homework for tonight is page 13, numbers 1, 2, 4, 6, 9, 12, 14, and 15. Okay?